Welcome to Toolbox Basics. This is the first in a series of 8 lectures introducing the Brain Dynamics Toolbox. Now, the Toolbox is software for simulating the types of dynamical systems that you typically encounter in computational neuroscience. Now, this usually involves simulating the action potential of some biological cell or even a network of cells. So conceptually, this is done by writing down the equivalent circuit of the cell, and from the equivalent circuit we can obtain a system of differential equations, and these equations describe the instantaneous change in the voltage across the cell membrane. Once we have these equations in hand, we can integrate them forwards in time to build up the time series of the action potential. Now, in practice, these equations have highly nonlinear terms in them, and so there is no analytic solution available to us. We must instead use numerical methods, and that usually involves writing custom code to both define the differential equations themselves, but also to pass those equations onto the solver and to visualize the results that the solver returns. And that process can get quite cumbersome. And this is where the Brain Dynamics Toolbox fits in. It effectively takes your user-defined differential equations and turns them into an interactive graphical application. And it does so without any graphical programming effort on your behalf. All you need to do is to define those differential equations, and the Toolbox takes care of calling the relevant solvers and plotting the results for you. Now, it supports 3 classes of differential equations, namely ordinary differential equations, delay differential equations, and stochastic differential equations. And each of these 3 classes can also be extended in space by casting them as a system of partial differential equations, and we do that using the method of lines. So here's an example of a spatial model running in the graphical interface. And in this case, it's a sheet of 100 by 100 Fitsu Nagumo cells. And here it is. Here the model is simulating the onset of arrhythmogenesis in a sheet of cardiac tissue. So how does it work? You can think of the Toolbox as the central hub that connects your custom models to the existing numerical solvers that are supplied by MATLAB, as well as to the existing display panels that are provided by the Brain Dynamics Toolbox. So once you've defined your model, you can then apply any combination of solvers and display panels to it with no additional programming effort. Now, because the software is itself modular, you can also write your own user-defined numerical solvers, and you can also write your own user-defined display panels if you wish to. And you might wish to do that if you have some special need that's not covered by the existing tools. But in general, you really only need to define those differential equations, and the Toolbox takes care of the rest. And here is what the code for a typical model looks like. I won't go into all the details, obviously, but I just want to highlight this part of the code from lines 72 to 89. This is the core ODE function that defines the differential equations. The rest of the code is more or less boilerplate that tells the graphical interface the names and formats of the various state variables and parameters. But here is the differential equations themselves. And if you're at all familiar with using the MATLAB ODE solvers, then you ought to recognize the format of this function here at line 72. It is indeed the same format. But mostly I just want to emphasize that the amount of code that you have to write for a user-defined model is not that much. It's less than 100 lines, and that's very short, but it still provides this very rich graphical application. And this graphical application really is essentially a model-specific simulator. So you get a lot of bang for your buck for your 100 lines of code. But it's not all about the graphical interface, of course. The Toolbox also provides a suite of command line tools which you can use for scripting large-scale simulations and systematic parameter surveys. And this combination of scripting and interactivity really bodes well for the typical life cycle of a research project, where you would iterate between interactive exploratory modes of working and systematic, fully scripted ways of doing large-scale surveys and simulations. And I've included a third method here called semi-automated, and I haven't talked about this yet. I cover this in subsequent lectures, but by semi-automated I mean that you can use the MATLAB workspace to control the graphical application directly. And this is very convenient for running rapid parameter surveys during prototyping. Now, of course, the final stage in any research project is the dissemination of the results. And this can be done by uploading the code that you've written to some public server such as zenodo.org. Now, if you haven't heard of Zenodo, it's an archive quality repository for digital resources. And people use it to host the source code that accompanies their papers and preprints. And the good thing about Zenodo is that every upload gets a citable digital object identifier that you can use. And Zenodo also has a community collection for models based on the Brain Dynamics Toolbox. So I encourage you to use that. But of course, the best place to get started is with the example models that are shipped with the Toolbox. And the list of those models is provided in Chapter 1 of the handbook. The handbook is the official guide to using the Toolbox, so I encourage you to get a copy of that. And Chapter 1 describes how to install the Toolbox and how to run your first model. And that will be the topic of the next lecture. But for now, I just want to give you a quick tour of some of these models so that you can get a good sense of the kind of variety of dynamical systems that you can simulate. And these examples are also included in the gallery of models on the bdtoolbox.org website. And so here we have some point neurons. On the left we have the Hodgkin-Huxley model of the action potential in the giant axon of the squid. In the middle we have a simplification of that model by Pospashul and colleagues, and in this case it's demonstrating intrinsic bursting. On the right we have the Morris-Lacar model of the action potential in barnacle muscles. So these are all examples of classic point neurons. We also have examples of neural mass models, and these are models where the actions of hundreds if not thousands of neurons are lumped together, and neural mass models are often used to simulate whole brain dynamics for simulating fMRI and EEG signals and so forth. There are also examples of spatial models. On the left we have the 2D wave equation, and on the right is that Fitsu Nagumo model of cardiac tissue I showed you earlier. And there are some examples of stochastic models also. So here on the left we have arithmetic Brownian motion, which is the basis of drift and diffusion. And on the right we have geometric Brownian motion, which is the basics of the Black-Scholes models that are typically used in mathematical finance. So you might get a sense here that we're not just restricted to models in neuroscience, but we can also apply the Brain Dynamics Toolbox to many other fields. And along that vein, we also have examples of mathematical normal forms of bifurcations. So on the left here we have the Hopf bifurcation. So it describes the birth of a limit cycle for a fixed point. And this type of bifurcation actually replicates the essence of a type 2 neuron. So a type 2 neuron is one that responds with more or less the same frequency when it's stimulated, but the amplitude of the spike increases with injection current. On the right is the saddle node bifurcation on a limit cycle, and this describes the sudden appearance of a limit cycle when a saddle point and a stable fixed point collide. And this type of bifurcation replicates the essence of a type 1 neuron. So a type 1 neuron is a neuron where the spike amplitude remains fairly constant, but the frequency of firing increases with increased stimulation. And lastly, we have some examples of classic models from nonlinear dynamics, including the chaotic Lorentz attractor, the van der Pol oscillator, and the damped and driven pendulum. So if you're teaching a class in dynamical systems, then you can use any of these models in your classes to help the students understand those particular models. So that brings us to the end of this lecture. I hope it's given you a better sense of how you can use the toolbox in your own research and teaching. So please join me in the next lecture where I'll be showing you how to install the toolbox and run your first model.